It was nearly midnight when Thomas first noticed the station. He had been walking home the same way he always did, through the fog-draped streets of the old part of town, past shuttered bakeries and windows lit only by the blue flicker of sleeping televisions. The night was quiet, but not too quiet. There was the distant hum of electricity, the rustle of leaves in corners the wind had forgotten. Familiar things. But that night just beyond the old iron bridge, the one that hadn't carried a train in 50 years, there was a light. A dim amber glow, the kind used in places that don't want to disturb the dark, but still want to be seen. Curious Thomas slowed, and there it was, a train station. It sat where nothing should have been tucked under the shadow of the hill, surrounded by ivy-covered fences and forgotten hedges. No signpost, no schedule, no signs of construction. Just a small building, its roof gently curved like a memory of old European terminals. A clock hung crookedly above the door. The hands pointed to 12. Inside it was warm. Thomas didn't remember walking in, but he found himself standing in the waiting room, which smelled faintly of wood polish and lavender. The benches were empty, save for one, a woman in a long coat fast asleep with her head against her suitcase. The walls were lined with faded posters, destinations he didn't recognize, the Valley of Still Waters station. Opaline platform of the last letters. And then the sound. A train whistle, soft and low like a sigh, echoed from the tunnel beyond the platform. Not a sharp blast, not a modern horn, but something gentler, older. It sent a shiver through him, not of fear, but of remembrance, though he couldn't say what it was he remembered. The train rolled in slowly, without screech or rumble. The wheels seemed to hum a lullaby as they turned. It was an old-style engine, dark blue with brass fittings and glowing windows. Steam curled out like breath in winter. And though it looked heavy, it moved like it weighed nothing at all. A conductor stepped out. He was tall and wore a perfectly tailored coat, his gloved hands clasped in front of him. But the strangest thing, something Thomas only noticed after a moment, was that the man cast no shadow. Though the lights behind him were bright, the floor beneath him was untouched. The conductor looked directly at Thomas and gave a slight nod. Then, silently, he lifted a hand and gestured toward the open door of the first car. Thomas hesitated. He had work tomorrow. A bed, a cat, a half-finished book waiting on his nightstand. His life was unremarkable but known, predictable, safe. But something deep inside him, something quiet and half asleep, leaned forward. That part of him had always loved stories, trains, maps, the mystery of things without explanation. And there, in that moment of fog and stillness, Thomas understood that this was not a train you caught with a plan. It was a train that arrived when something in you was ready. So he stepped forward. The door closed behind him with a gentle click. The interior of the car was dimly lit by golden sconces. Velvet seats lined the walls, and a soft hum vibrated through the floor. Outside the window, the station began to slip away, not fast, not suddenly, but as if being gently folded into the past. He didn't ask where it was going. He didn't need to. Because some journeys don't begin with questions. They begin with a quiet heart and the sound of a train arriving where it never should have been. And so the curious train moved on through the night. Thomas wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting when the conductor returned. The train moved so gently he could hardly tell it was moving at all. Outside the window, the world had gone dim and strange, more like a memory of landscape than landscape itself. Hills softened into shadows, trees into silhouettes, and the moon, though full, hung low and heavy, like it had forgotten to rise all the way. The conductor stepped silently into the car, the same quiet man from the platform. He wore the same long navy coat, brass buttons shining like stars. His cap was straight, his eyes polite but unreadable. He walked with the precision of someone who had done this for centuries, and perhaps he had. But again, no shadow. Even with the warm light pouring from the ceiling sconces, the conductor moved like a figure cut from the night itself. Where others might leave a trace, he left only stillness. "Ticket, sir," he said, finally breaking the silence with a voice like silk sliding across stone. Calm, patient, certain. Thomas looked down. He didn't remember being given a ticket, but there it was, tucked into the breast pocket of his coat. Faded cream paper edges curled with ornate letters, written in ink that shimmered faintly. It read only, "To where you've needed to go." The conductor inspected it without touching. He nodded once. "Cabin 9, he said, as though the number itself held meaning. "Follow me, if you please." They walked in silence down the corridor of the train. Each cabin door they passed had a small brass plaque, each with a name carved in elegant cursive, not of people, but of concepts. The Lantern Hour whispers from the bay. The Sleeper's Waltz. One door was ajar, and Thomas caught a glimpse of an old man sitting inside humming to himself and playing a melody on a glass harmonica. They reached cabin 9. The conductor opened the door with a key that shimmered slightly in his gloved hand. Thomas stepped inside. It was beautiful. Warm amber light filled the space, spilling softly over shelves of well-loved books. A velvet armchair by the window, and a kettle resting atop a small brass stove. There was no bed, but there didn't need to be one. The room itself felt like sleep. Safe, sheltered. Like a deep breath taken after too many years of holding one's chest tight. A photograph hung on the wall, though Thomas didn't remember ever taking it. In the image, a boy himself perhaps stood in a field of dandelions, looking skyward, eyes wide with wonder. The frame was etched with tiny stars. The conductor remained at the door. "If you need anything," he said, "you need only close your eyes." Then he turned to leave. But Thomas couldn't help himself. "Wait," he asked. "Where does this train go?" The conductor paused. Some ask that he replied, turning just enough for Thomas to see the faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Some don't. And what do you tell them? I tell them this: not all trains carry you to a place. Some carry you to a moment. One you left behind, or one you haven't yet reached. He tipped his cap. Then, as quietly as he had come, he vanished down the corridor, his footsteps fading like mist. Thomas sat down in the velvet chair and stared out the window. The scenery no longer resembled anything from Earth. It flowed like watercolor melted edges and dreamlike hues, shifting from soft blue forests to golden meadows that shimmered with sleep. He didn't feel tired. He felt held. The train let out another gentle sigh of a whistle, and Thomas realized something he hadn't before: he didn't need to understand everything. Not tonight. Not. Some stories weren't puzzles to solve, but lullabies to listen to. And this train, this curious train, was singing him to sleep, one soft wheel turn at a time. Thomas sat perfectly still in the velvet chair, hands folded in his lap as the train continued its quiet procession through a world that barely seemed to exist. The room around him, cabin number 9, was both unfamiliar and intimately known, like a dream he'd visited often, but never remembered upon waking. The scent of old Page's cinnamon and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. Outside the window, the world slid by in slow motion. Forests of deep indigo bled into dunes of shifting silver, and sometimes, just sometimes, he could swear the stars were moving the other way, drifting backward as though time were rewinding. He reached out to touch the small kettle on the brass stove. The metal was warm, but not hot, humming ever so faintly. A porcelain teacup already sat beside it, filled with a steaming amber liquid. He hadn't made it. He didn't remember seeing anyone enter the cabin. And yet it was there exactly when he needed it. Thomas took a sip. The tea tasted like comfort, like rainy afternoons and flannel blankets. Like childhood, perhaps, but not in a cloying way. More like the feeling of a day when nothing hurt and nothing hurried. As he set the cup down, he noticed something odd. The window no longer reflected his image. He leaned closer, but the glass only showed the strange landscape beyond. No sign of his face, his eyes, his movement. It was as though the cabin had forgotten to include his reflection. Or perhaps the train simply didn't believe in mirrors. A soft knock came at the door. Thomas opened it to find no one waiting. Only a small square package wrapped in brown paper resting on the floor. No tag, no ribbon. Just his name written in that same shimmering ink as his ticket. He brought it inside and carefully opened the package. Inside was a notebook. The cover was worn leather tied shut with a frayed cord. When he untied it and opened to the first page, his breath caught. It was his handwriting. Page after page, letter after letter. Things he'd written but forgotten. Scribbles on napkins, unfinished poems from his 20s, love letters he never sent, and thoughts he thought no one would ever read. Some were embarrassing, some tender. Some were fragments, others whole, all of them his. At the back of the notebook, a line was written in large looping script. "We never truly lose the words. The train keeps them for us." He closed the notebook and set it beside the teacup. The lights in the cabin dimmed ever so slightly, not enough to cause alarm, but just enough to suggest that night was folding deeper into itself. Thomas leaned back in the chair. His eyes wandered toward the ceiling, where faint constellations had begun to appear, not painted but glowing softly, shifting with the motion of the train. He could hear something now, a music he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't coming from the corridor or the speakers. There were no speakers, but from within the walls. A distant music box tune playing in slow time as though underwater. It wound around him like a lullaby, whispered in a foreign tongue, something meant not to be understood, but felt. Suddenly, the train slowed. Outside the window, a platform emerged, not a station exactly, but a glowing stretch of polished wood floating in darkness. Lanterns floated above it like fireflies, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw someone standing there. A child, perhaps, or an old man. But when he blinked, they were gone. The train didn't stop. It simply drifted past. And as it did, Thomas heard a whisper, not in his ear, but in his mind. "This cabin remembers everything you left behind." He didn't know where the voice came from. Maybe the conductor, maybe the train itself. But it felt right, familiar, like something that had been waiting patiently to be said for years. Thomas wrapped himself in the soft wool blanket draped over the armchair. He didn't feel tired exactly, but peaceful. As if sleep were not something to fall into, but something to arrive at, like a station you'd been heading toward your whole life. And cabin number 9, it seemed, would carry him there. Sometime after the train passed the glowing platform, Thomas must have dozed off, though he couldn't remember the exact moment he crossed into sleep. The border between waking and dreaming aboard the curious train was paper thin. He woke to a gentle tapping at the window. Not from outside, but inside the dreamlike landscape beyond it, like someone had knocked on the glass from the other side of memory. The scene outside had changed. It was now a soft meadow, blanketed with stars instead of flowers, and the sky above rippled as if underwater. Someone cleared their throat softly. He turned. A woman now sat across from him, though he hadn't heard the door open. She was older, perhaps 60, but ageless in the way certain stories are. Her hair was silver and pinned neatly, and she wore a cloak embroidered with tiny golden gears and moons. Around her left wrist, she wore a delicate bracelet, except it wasn't a bracelet. It was a clock. And it wasn't just on her wrist, it was her wrist. The hands of the clock ticked slowly beneath translucent skin, as though she carried time like blood. "Do you mind if I sit here?" she asked, though she already had. Thomas shook his head. No, of course not. She smiled, warm and sad all at once. "I always choose cabin 9 when I need to remember who I used to be." Thomas wasn't sure how to respond to that. He managed, "Have we met before?" "Oh, no," she said, waving a gloved hand. "But everyone meets in some form or another aboard this train. It's part of the rules, unwritten though they are." Her eyes gleamed with something he couldn't quite name. She looked at the little notebook still resting on the table beside him. "Your memories came early," she said, nodding. "The train must trust you." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Is that what it is?" "Trust? Partly. Mostly curiosity. The train likes the ones who still wonder." He glanced at her wrist at the ticking clock, and Sheet looked down at the clock hands moving slowly beneath her skin. "I'm what they call a keeper. There are a few of us. We're passengers like anyone else, but we stay aboard longer than most." She leaned in. "I keep time, not the way clocks do, but the way feelings do." Thomas frowned gently. "I don't follow." She chuckled, the sound like paper turning. "Well, think of a moment. A real one. Maybe it lasted 3 seconds in life, but a decade in your heart. Or the opposite, a year that passed, but left no trace at all. Time isn't honest, Thomas. It stretches and shrinks, forgets and clings. I measure that." He stared at her, something opening in his chest. "I had a moment like that once," he said softly. "A goodbye. It only took a few minutes, but I've carried it for years." She nodded, eyes kind. "Most of us have. That's why we end up here." Outside the window, the meadow had begun to fade into something else, an endless library with books that moved like tides. The train, it seemed, was drifting through thoughts. She pulled a small object from her coat pocket, a music box. It was shaped like a train car, etched with stars. She set it on the table and turned the crank once. A soft lullaby spilled into the room. Thomas didn't recognize the melody, but it felt like something he'd heard in childhood, half remembered through sleep and rain. "I listen to this," she said, "when I need to remember a time I haven't reached yet." Thomas blinked. "You mean the future?" She smiled gently. "Dreams are future memories, aren't they?" He sat back in the chair and let the music wash over him. The hands on her wrist ticked slower now, as if time itself were relaxing. After a long, quiet pause, he asked, "How long does the train go on for?" She looked at him, then out the window. "As long as you need it to." And with that, the lights in cabin 9 dimmed again just a little. The train sighed along its track of memory and sky, and the stars drifted ever closer. When Thomas woke again, the music box was gone. So was the lady with the clock hands. The notebook lay closed beside him, and the kettle on the brass stove hissed softly, as though the train itself had been waiting for him to return. He stretched, feeling a calm weightlessness in his limbs, the kind of peace that only comes when you no longer try to measure time. The only thing that reminded him the world was moving at all was the low hum of the wheels and the shimmer of the sky sliding past the window, now a velvet canvas painted with pale moons. There was a soft knock at the cabin door. This time when he opened it, someone was standing there. A man tall and thin, with spectacles that magnified his already wide eyes. He wore a long coat stitched with compass roses and faded lines that looked like paths through invisible lands. A leather satchel hung across his shoulder, so worn it looked older than the train. "Pardon me," the man said in a voice that fluttered like parchment. "Would you mind terribly if I borrowed your kettle? Mine ran dry 3 stops ago, and it's so difficult to chart dream latitudes without tea." Thomas blinked. "Of course, come in." The man bowed graciously and stepped into cabin 9, his fingers already extracting a small mesh pouch of herbs from his satchel. "I'm Reuben," he said as he poured hot water into a tiny clay cup he produced from some secret pocket. "Cartographer. Sleepless division." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Sleepless division? Yes, yes. Most maps are drawn from memory, but mine are drawn from dreams. You see, I can't sleep. Haven't for, about 40 years. But the upside is, I've become rather good at walking through other people's dreams. Much easier to map places you never wake up in." He took a sip, nodded with satisfaction, and then spread a folded paper across the cabin's small table. Thomas leaned in. It wasn't a map of anywhere he recognized. It wasn't even a map of somewhere possible. Rivers twisted into the shape of cursive handwriting mountains resembled sleeping faces, and cities were labeled with names like Regret's Orchard and Midnight's Whisper. One section simply read, "Here be the maybe." "It changes," Reuben said, "every time someone aboard the train dreams. The terrain folds, unravels, and rewrites itself depending on memory mood and moonlight." Thomas frowned. "So you map the inside of people's minds?" No, Reuben said. "Not their minds, they're wandering. It's different. Minds are full of thoughts. Wandering is what happens when you let go of them." He took another long sip of tea and added, "This train moves through those places. Not physically, no. But in the quiet corners between stops, I'm here to record them before they vanish." He pulled out a stub of a pencil and with a steady hand began sketching a new line onto the map. As he did, the paper seemed to shimmer faintly as if accepting the change without resistance. Thomas asked, "Do people ever find their way back to these places?" Reuben smiled, but it was a tired smile, one full of pages and lost things. "Sometimes," he said, "when they need to. When a piece of their heart forgot to leave." They sat in silence for a while, the tea steeping its warmth into their fingers, the train humming gently around them. Finally, Reuben folded the map with a loving touch and returned it to his satchel. "Thank you for the water," he said, standing. and for the company. Most passengers sleep straight through. Thomas nodded. I'm glad I didn't. The cartographer paused at the door, then turned. Cabin 9 is a rare one. It lets you meet people you don't know you need yet, or versions of yourself you'd forgotten. Keep your window open tonight. We may pass through a place you once imagined as a child. And with that, he vanished down the hallway, his footsteps silent, his shadow long and thin, like a path on a distant map. Thomas returned to his chair, feeling the kettle warm again beside him. Outside, the sky had changed once more. Now there were islands floating in the clouds, each one flickering with lights like lanterns lit in a paper sea. The train rumbled softly on, and Thomas' heart, full of wonder, watched it all with eyes half dreaming. The world outside had stopped making sense in the usual way. After Reuben the cartographer left, Thomas found it harder and harder to tell what time it was. Not because of the absence of clocks. There was one tucked into the corner of the cabin, its hands politely frozen at 3:33. But because the feeling of time had begun to warp. It no longer moved forward. It circled. He first noticed it when he passed the same corridor twice. He had stepped out of cabin 9 just to stretch his legs. The hallway was lined with small windows and soft carpeting, warm golden lights humming in their sconces. He nodded at a sleepy porter, dusting a shelf of antique teacups. But when he returned a few minutes later, he passed the very same porter, dusting the very same teacup. And this time, the porter looked up and said, "Back so soon." Thomas blinked. "I didn't think I left." The porter only smiled. "Few do, sir, few do." Back in his cabin, Thomas opened the notebook again. A new page had appeared, though he hadn't written it. The handwriting was unmistakably his, though the words were unfamiliar. You've passed this way before, but never with your eyes open. Not until now. He set the notebook down and looked out the window. The train was passing a shoreline of pure white sand. Children were building castles made of light. And then, without warning, it was gone, replaced instantly by a snow-covered pine forest where paper birds hung from branches like ornaments. Then back to the beach. Then the forest again, looping. He rubbed his eyes, thinking perhaps he was still dreaming. But the train's whistle, soft and low, like an old man humming to himself, echoed through the car. The sound grounded him, comforted him. And then the strangest thing happened. There was a knock at the door. Familiar, timid. He opened it. Standing there was himself. A younger version, maybe 20 years younger. Hair unkempt, eyes wide, and searching shoulders hunched with the uncertain weight of youth. Neither of them spoke at first. Thomas could feel his heart beating in his ears. "You're me," he finally whispered. The younger man nodded. "I think so." They sat across from each other in silence. The kettle refilled itself with a quiet hiss, and the train continued to drift through loops of weather memory and dream. "I had a dream once," the younger Thomas said, voice quiet about a train that never stopped. "I was 10. I thought if I could just get on it, I'd never have to grow up." "You did grow up, the older," Thomas said softly. The younger smiled, wistful. "I know, but sometimes I think I left pieces of myself behind. On the playground. In a letter I never sent. In a song I only listened to when the world felt too loud." Thomas looked out the window again. The dream line looped once more. The hallway door opened again, and this time a woman stepped in. Not the lady with the clock hands. Someone else. Familiar. Her eyes were green. Her laugh used to live in his chest. And for a moment, the air between them filled with things unsaid. "You remember me?" she asked gently. "Yes," he said. "Too well." She walked to the window and looked out at the rolling dreamscape, then turned to him. "This train carries more than passengers, Thomas. It carries echoes, moments that want to be felt again. Some loop until we've heard them properly." Then she stepped back through the door and was gone. Thomas sat quietly, younger and older versions of himself, breathing in unison. Outside, the world shimmered, then stilled. The train crossed through the same bridge for the third time, and this time, the sky above it wasn't stars or moons, but a giant floating memory. A room full of people singing happy birthday, a cake melting from too many candles, and his mother's voice whispering, "Don't blink. It goes fast." The younger version of him stood, nodded once, and opened the door. Before he left, he said, "Thank you for not forgetting me." And with that, he vanished into the hallway. The kettle let out one last breath of steam. Thomas leaned back in his chair and exhaled. Perhaps the loops weren't mistakes. Perhaps they were second chances. And as the curious train circled once more, he let it take him gently around again, just until he was ready to move forward. The stars arrived just after tea. Not with noise, not with ceremony, they simply stepped aboard. Thomas had been half asleep again, lulled by the rhythm of the train and the soft crackle of something invisible warming the cabin. He'd been reading a note he found tucked behind the cushion of his chair, written in a language he couldn't read, but somehow understood. It spoke of light as a kind of memory, of how even the faintest star was a record of longing shining across centuries. Then the lights flickered. Not out, but different. They glowed cooler, softer, like starlight through clouds. Outside the window, the night sky no longer raced by. It stood still as if the train had stopped, but Thomas felt no jolt, no lurch, only silence, deep and velvet. And then figures began to appear on the platform outside. Not people, stars. They had no solid form, not really. They shimmered as outlines, gentle glows in the shape of travelers. Some wore coats, others cloaks of mist and flame. They didn't carry luggage. They were the luggage bundles of time and memory held in delicate shape. One stepped aboard. Thomas felt it more than saw it. A flicker, a breath, a warmth against the chill that had started to settle in his chest. The door to cabin 9 opened softly. A star stood there. It looked like a boy he used to know, Jamie, from 2nd grade. The one who moved away suddenly, who gave Thomas his favorite marble on the last day of school, saying, "It's lucky, don't lose it." Thomas had lost it within a week. The star boy didn't speak, but in his glow, Thomas remembered the laughter of that last recess, the chalky smell of the playground wall, the hope that someone who leaves might come back if you wish hard enough. Another star entered. This one pulsed with a different hue, blue and gold, soft as silk. It drifted to the center of the cabin and hovered. It smelled faintly of wild jasmine and wet stone. It was his grandmother. Not as he remembered her in her final years, but younger. Laughing in a garden, reading by a window, singing songs in a language he'd never known the meaning of, but which always made him feel safe. The stars didn't stay long. One by one, they passed through the cabin like ghosts, with purpose not haunting, but gifting. Each one brought a feeling, a moment, a memory too old or too quiet to reach on their own. Thomas didn't cry. He didn't need to. He remembered. And in that remembering, he felt whole in a way he hadn't since childhood. As if he'd been walking around with doors inside him half closed, and the stars knew just which ones to unlock. At one point, the sky outside began to move again, not forward but down. It descended gently like snow, and then it entered the train. The ceiling above cabin 9 turned translucent. Constellations pulsed above him. Orion, Lyra, Cygnus, all of them shifting like dancers. They weren't just names now. They were stories. Each star a word. Each constellation a sentence written across the cosmos, waiting for someone to read aloud. The final star to visit was small, dim even. A faint flicker that hovered near the floor. It looked like nothing. But when it brushed past Thomas, his breath caught. He didn't know the memory, not at first. It was too old, too faint. But then he felt it. A cradle, a lullaby, a heartbeat not his own. The first time he felt held, it was the memory of being a baby. A fragment he never knew he still carried. When it left, Thomas whispered, "Thank you." The star pulsed once, then faded. And then they were gone. All of them. As quietly as they'd arrived, the stars returned to the night, stepping off at a platform that only existed for them. The train resumed its journey slow and steady. The kettle sang again. Thomas sat in silence, eyes closed, hand pressed gently to his chest, where the afterglow of memory still lingered. Some passengers bring luggage, some bring stories, and some, like the stars, bring the pieces of you that you didn't even know had wandered away. The train slowed but didn't whistle. No horn, no announcement. Just the subtle hush of wheels easing their song, the muffled settling of porcelain on a shelf, and the sigh of a journey pausing, not ending, just resting. Thomas felt the shift before he saw it. Something changed in the air. The cabin grew warmer, denser, not with heat, but with presence. Like something long lost had quietly returned and taken a seat just behind him. He stood and looked out the window. There was no station in sight, no building, no clock, no crowd. Just a wooden platform stretched across a grassy hill, bathed in gold light from no visible source. Wildflowers lined the edges, lavender daisies, a few dandelions caught mid-wish, and a soft breeze stirred through the tall grass. And the smell, it hit him all at once. Warm bread, soapstone, rain on pavement, the tang of cut citrus, a faint note of his father's aftershave, the dusty spice of an old bookshelf. It didn't add up to anything yet. Somehow it was unmistakable. It smelled like home. Not any place he had lived in exactly, but the feeling of home. That deep cellular sense of belonging that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. A specific kind of stillness, like being cradled by time. Thomas stepped off the train. He wasn't sure if he opened the door himself or if it opened for him. Either way, his feet found the platform, and the moment they touched the wood, he felt lighter, as if memory had reached out and unhooked something heavy from his chest. The grass swayed. A bell tolled once far away and without urgency. A child ran past him barefoot, laughing not to anyone, just to the sky. Behind her, an old man sat on a bench, humming a tune Thomas hadn't heard since childhood cartoons. A woman stood near a field hanging out white sheets that never wrinkled her hands, moving in the slow rhythm of someone who no longer feared time. No one spoke to him, and yet they all acknowledged him. A glance, a smile, a nod, like he had come back from a long journey, and they were simply glad he had found his way again. He wandered. There was a small orchard near the edge of the platform, fig trees and plums heavy with fruit. A swing swayed gently tied to the thick branch of an old oak. For a moment, Thomas swore he saw his younger self on it pumping his legs too hard, falling backward into laughter. But when he blinked, it was just the swing again. Still moving. He sat on a bench that smelled like summer. It was then he noticed the sign faded barely legible carved into the back of the seat. This stop has no name, but you'll know when it's yours. He closed his eyes. And in the stillness, the scents changed, folded, rose, and disappeared like passing clouds. Now the smell of sea salt and mangoes. Now hot coffee and old flannel. Now chamomile and the scent of someone who once kissed his forehead goodnight. It didn't matter whose memories these were. They all belonged to someone, maybe to everyone. Eventually, the conductor appeared beside him, silent as ever. He didn't speak but offered his hand. Thomas hesitated. He could have stayed there forever, he realized. On that bench. On that platform. Wrapped in scents and feelings so old they had lost their names. But the train still waited. And the journey wasn't done. He stood. Together, they walked back to cabin 9. As the train began to move again, Thomas looked out the window and saw the platform vanish. Not fade, not roll out of view, but vanish like a dream dissolving at the moment of waking. And yet, the scent lingered. Not strong, but just enough. A note of home folded in the air like a memory tucked under a pillow. The train had picked up speed again, though time didn't seem to notice. Thomas sat in cabin 9, the smell of home still faint in the air, like the last note of a lullaby. Outside, the world had changed again. Now, a winding landscape of rooftops and staircases, some upside down, some floating, none connected by roads. The train rolled on through it like it was perfectly normal. He decided to walk. His legs needed to move, and his thoughts needed somewhere to stretch. He passed through a dining car filled with flickering candles and sleeping passengers, curled like cats on velvet cushions. He nodded to a waiter polishing a wine glass that sparkled faintly in the dark, though no wine was ever poured. Further down the train, he reached a luggage car. There was no reason for him to enter. He hadn't packed anything after all, but the door was slightly ajar, and something pulled at him. Not his hand, not his body, something else. He stepped inside. The air was different here, cooler, thicker, as if the train itself held its breath within this room. The luggage was arranged not by size or destination, but emotion. He knew this without being told. There were suitcases that buzzed faintly with anxiety bags that glowed with joy, trunks so heavy with grief they sagged the floor beneath them. He passed them gently, respectfully, as if moving through someone else's dreams. Then he saw it. A small, battered brown suitcase, scratched at the corners. A faded tag still tied to the handle, the ink barely legible. And there on the tag, his name. Not Thomas, but a name only one person had ever called him Tommy. It hit him like a wave, his mother's voice singing in the kitchen, the clink of spoons against ceramic, the feel of her wool sweater when she hugged him after bad dreams. She'd called him that every day until she didn't anymore. He knelt beside the suitcase. It wasn't locked. Inside, the contents were wrapped in an old floral scarf he hadn't seen in decades. Unfolding it felt like unsealing something sacred. He found a stack of letters, unsent, all addressed in his mother's careful script, to him, one for each birthday since she passed. The ink had faded. Some of the paper had yellowed, curled at the edges. But the words, oh, the words were whole. He picked up the top one and read, "My dearest Tommy, I know you probably won't believe this, but I still listen for your footsteps down the hall even now. I imagine you grown taller, wiser, sadder maybe, but still you. I hope you found a life with pockets of joy. If you're reading this, it means you found your way to something strange. Good. I always told you your heart was made for wonder." He stopped. His throat ached. He didn't cry. The tears didn't need to fall this time. Instead, he felt something gentler, a release, like a hand on the shoulder after a long silence. He sat for a while reading. Some letters were funny, full of half-remembered recipes and gentle teasing. Some were sad, written in days she must have missed him so fiercely she had to write just to breathe again. But all of them glowed with one thing: love, a quiet, unconditional kind. The kind that stays folded in the corners of memory long after the voice that spoke it is gone. When he finally closed the suitcase, the floral scarf wrapped itself around the letters as if tucking them in. He stood lighter somehow, not because he'd let go of anything, but because something had come back. As he turned to leave the luggage car, he saw something written on the wall above the door. Letters carved faintly as if by fingernail or thought. "We do not carry things to keep them. We carry them to remember how to put them down." He stepped back into the corridor. The train was moving through a soft fog now, stars like floating lanterns outside the windows. And as Thomas returned to cabin 9, he placed a hand over his chest where the ache had been. It was still there, but gentler. It began with a smell. Not strong, not immediate, just the faintest trace petrichor, that earthy scent after rain. But it came from inside the cabin, not the world rushing past the windows. Thomas looked up. No clouds, no thunder, but a single drop fell, then another. They didn't fall from the ceiling. They seemed to condense in the air itself. Tiny pearls of water forming in the soft glow of the lights, gathering like thoughts long suppressed before falling slowly, silently into existence. The first one landed on his open palm. It didn't sting, it didn't chill. It hummed, like a memory. He blinked, and the rain began to fall gently all across cabin 9, not torrential, not wild. Just a slow, steady rhythm of drops that made no puddles left, no mess. They soaked into the velvet cushions like sighs, and soaked into Thomas like lullabies. But with each drop, he felt something. A voice, a moment, a feeling. Not overwhelming, not painful, just present. One drop brought back the quiet ache of being 16 and not knowing how to say, "I'm sorry." Another carried the weight of leaving a room and never returning to it until now in this very moment. He stood and walked to the window. The rain outside was still dry. Impossible. Stars gleamed as if nothing inside the train had changed. But inside it rained. On the floor, on his shoulders, on the notebook which somehow didn't blur. The ink held its lines as though even words respected this kind of weather. There was music too. Not loud, not even melodic. Just a low resonance like a cello bow across a heartstring. It drifted in and out between drops in the same way feelings do, arriving unexpectedly dissolving, just before you can name them. And then she entered, not through the door. She was already there, sitting by the stove as though she had always been. Her face was familiar, but not in the way faces usually are. It was a composite of every woman Thomas had loved and lost. A childhood friend who moved away. A first crush who never knew. A partner he'd let go too soon. A stranger who once held his gaze for a little too long on a rainy bus ride. She was not any of them, but she was all of them. And when she looked at him, he didn't feel confusion or fear. He felt permission to remember, to feel, to forgive. "You're in the middle of your storm," she said, her voice like soft thunder. Thomas nodded. "It doesn't feel bad." "No," she said, "it's not meant to. Rain isn't sadness, it's how the sky remembers." She stood and walked toward him, but the drops never touched her. He, on the other hand, was soaked in the soul, not the skin. Yet the warmth never left his chest. He asked, "Does the rain ever stop?" She smiled. "Only when you've listened." Then, without further word, she turned to the notebook on the table, ran a finger down the open page, and vanished. The rain slowed. The scent of earth became something else, like steam rising from a mug of tea held in winter hands. Thomas sat again and listened. To the rain, to his breath, to his thoughts now softened by the rhythm of falling. He didn't write. He didn't need to. The train was writing now, in drops, in pauses, in silence. By the time he looked up, the last drop had fallen. The lights warmed once more. The air cleared crisp and full of something newly born space. Not emptiness, not loss, just space for something new to begin. There are places that don't appear on maps, not because they're hidden, but because they only exist in between. Between sleep and waking, between memory and forgetting, between two stops on a train that should not exist. Thomas had just begun to drift again, his thoughts swaying gently with the movement of the rails, when the train slowed for the briefest of moments. Not enough for a proper stop, but just long enough for something to open. A door, a shimmer, a possibility. The cabin lights dimmed. A soft chime echoed through the corridor. And then, without warning or reason, the walls of cabin 9 shifted, folded outward like pages turning. The space widened, not with architecture, but with story. And suddenly he was no longer in his cabin. He was in a library, but not a grand marble one, not full of silence and ladders. This place was warm, lived in, infinite in its own modest way. The shelves were crooked. The armchairs were mismatched. Books lay open on tables as though recently abandoned by dreamers who had simply wandered off mid-thought. There were no librarians, just a sign hanging gently from a chain near the entrance. "Here you do not search, you are found." Thomas took a step forward. The floor creaked, but the sound was comforting like floorboards in a childhood home. Dust swirled lazily in shafts of golden light, though no visible sun shone. Somewhere a clock ticked, but not evenly. The rhythm matched his heartbeat. He wandered. The shelves bore no alphabetical order, no dewy decimals. Each section was labeled by emotion or memory. Regrets. I was too young to understand. Questions never asked, people who changed you, without knowing things you lost, but carried anyway. He passed rows and rows of books, each with no title on the spine. Only a feeling that reached out when he drew near. Some pulsed softly, others whispered. A few glowed faintly like fireflies. And then he saw it, a single book sitting on a pedestal near a round window that showed only clouds. It was small, leather-bound, worn at the corners. His name wasn't on it, but somehow it was his. When he touched it, it opened to the middle on its own. The page was handwritten, not in his script, but in a voice he recognized from somewhere deeper, the voice that sometimes narrated his thoughts when he was alone. He read, "You came here not to learn something new, but to remember what you already knew and forgot. You are not lost. You are simply not where you expected to be. That is not the same thing." He turned the page. The next entry was a letter from someone unnamed, but clearly meant for him. It told him not to hurry. That his timing had always been strange, but beautiful. That he had touched more people than he realized. That forgiveness wasn't something others gave, but something he had always owed himself. When he reached the end of the book, he noticed the last page was blank. No, waiting. A pen lay beside it. He hesitated. Then he wrote one line, "Thank you for holding these things when I couldn't." As he finished the stroke of the final letter, the library breathed. Not like a building, but like a living thing, relieved of a burden. The air shimmered. The walls folded inward again. The shelves whispered their farewells. The pedestal lowered gently into the floor like a memory being tucked in. And Thomas found himself once more in cabin 9, exactly where he had been. The kettle was still warm. The rain had long since passed. But now in his lap rested the small leather-bound book. He opened it again. The pages were blank, waiting for whatever came next. It was curiosity, not instruction, that led Thomas to the next car. Cabin 9 had quieted again. The book from the library rested peacefully on the shelf, its pages still blank, gently breathing with the rhythm of the train. But something tugged at him, a sensation just behind his thoughts, like someone softly calling his name in a dream, too faint to answer, but too persistent to ignore. He stepped into the hallway and walked past the tea cart, past the soundless piano lounge, past a corridor of flickering sconces shaped like cupped hands. He reached a door made of frosted glass rimmed in brass. Etched in flowing script were the words, "This is the car of forgotten names. You may enter, but you must listen." He pushed it open. The silence was immediate and complete, not empty dense. Like every sound had been absorbed and held close, tucked into the corners, like coats in a warm room. The car was full. Every seat was taken. Dozens of passengers sat quietly facing forward or gazing out windows. Each wore expressions of quiet peace and slight confusion, like they were in the middle of remembering something important but couldn't quite grasp it. There was no conversation, no introductions, no whispered greetings, because no one remembered who they were. Not exactly. Thomas walked slowly down the aisle. The faces he passed weren't blank, they were vivid with life. There were smiles, twitches of curiosity, the occasional gentle nod. But if you asked any of them their name, their story, their origin, they wouldn't have an answer. It wasn't frightening. It was freeing. Each person carried themselves not as someone lost, but as someone in pause. As though identity had been temporarily set aside like a coat removed before a long healing sleep. He sat beside a man in a wide-brimmed hat who was staring at his hands. "These used to make something," the man whispered, voice slow, thoughtful. "Something warm. I can't remember what. But the feeling, it's still in my fingers." Thomas nodded. Sometimes the hands remember what the mind forgets. Across the aisle, a woman was humming to herself, a melody that felt familiar but nameless. She closed her eyes as she swayed and whispered, "I used to sing this for someone. I think they forgave me." A conductor passed through, not the same one from earlier. This one was older, wore glasses fogged with time. He didn't ask for tickets. Instead, he held a small notebook, and as he walked, he leaned in gently to each passenger and whispered a single word into their ear. A name, the first name they ever spoke, or the last name someone spoke to them in love, or the name they called themselves in childhood when they pretended to be something else entirely. One by one, the passengers smiled, not as if waking up, but as if arriving. Not everyone received their name at once. Some continued to gaze forward, waiting. But those who did, those who heard it, stood silently and made their way to the next door. None looked back. The man beside Thomas was next. The conductor leaned in and whispered something Thomas couldn't hear. The man blinked, once smiled wide and soft, and whispered, "That's it. That's me." He rose, tipped his hat to Thomas, and walked on. When the conductor reached Thomas, he paused. They looked at each other for a moment. Then the conductor smiled. "You already remember," he said, and moved on. Thomas sat quietly, unsure whether he felt relieved or exposed. He looked around again at the remaining passengers. A girl with chalk on her sleeves, fidgeting with an invisible toy. An old woman sketching spirals into the fog on the window with her finger. A teenager pressing a seashell to his ear, even though there was no ocean. Each one wrapped in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because words were not the language needed here. Eventually, Thomas stood. He walked to the far end of the car, past those still waiting. As he reached the door, he glanced once more over his shoulder. And it was then he realized, no one here was truly alone. They had each other in quiet. And sometimes when names go missing, presence is enough. The door opened, light spilled in, and Thomas stepped into it. It began as most things aboard the curious train did, without warning. One moment, Thomas was standing in a corridor lit by golden sconces. His breath steady, the rhythm of the train like a lullaby beneath his feet. The next, darkness. Not the kind that scares, but the kind that hushes. The kind of darkness that closes your eyes for you. They had entered a tunnel. There was no announcement, no clatter, just the sudden absence of world. Outside the windows there was nothing. No stars, no lights, no landscape. Only black, endless and soft like velvet. But in the quiet there came voices. Not loud, not from any speaker. From everywhere and nowhere. Thomas froze, listening. A child's voice. I want to fly one day. I want to float above the trees and never come down. A woman's voice. Please stay. Just a little longer. You don't have to say anything, just stay. Then a laugh his own. Not from now, but years ago. A sound he hadn't heard since the summer he turned 11, falling into a creek and pretending it didn't hurt. He moved slowly down the train toward the center of the tunnel. The voices grew. Not louder, but closer. They weren't ghosts. They weren't thoughts. They were echoes. Dreams that had once been whispered, shouted, cried, or silently carried inside someone who couldn't say them aloud. Now they replayed here, not for judgment, not for reliving, for hearing. A conductor passed him. This one different again, tall, cloaked in something that shimmered with each echo. She nodded as she passed, saying, "Do not be afraid. They're only here to be known." Thomas entered a larger car, circular like a chamber. The walls were smooth and dark, and in the center was a silver ring hovering midair. Passengers stood in silence, some with eyes closed, some with hands on their hearts. None spoke. The ring pulsed, and when it did, each person heard a dream that belonged to them. One woman smiled as a lullaby in Russian filled the space around her. A man beside her wept silently, his hands clenched as a forgotten voice said, "You are enough. You always were." Thomas stepped closer to the ring. It pulsed for him, and he heard, "I forgive you." 3 words. No name, no explanation. But his knees almost buckled, because he knew exactly where those words came from. The voice, the moment. The year he had walked away and never looked back, telling himself it didn't matter that some things were better left broken. But the echo had waited, and now it had come back. He whispered, "I'm sorry." The ring pulsed again, just once, and then dimmed. The lights in the chamber warmed, slowly, carefully, like waking someone you love from a deep sleep. No one clapped. No one spoke. Each person carried their echo inward like a note folded into a pocket. The train exited the tunnel. Light returned to the windows, sunlight strangely. Not the pale moonlight of earlier, but dawn, gentle, amber, full of possibility. Thomas returned to cabin 9. It felt smaller now, but in the way a room feels smaller after you've grown inside it. Like it had stretched just enough to hold something new, and now it had exhaled. He sat. The tea kettle whistled again, soft as a bird. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of his own laughter returned, not as a haunting, but as a promise. The train began to slow, not in the way it had before, not the measured deceleration of approaching a stop, but something deeper, stranger, more deliberate. It was as though time itself bound to the wheels, and the rails had decided to ease its breath. Thomas noticed it first in the kettle. It had been just beginning to whistle its usual soft, curling sigh. But the sound now hung in the air, stretched long and low like a note held in reverence. The steam curled upward, not in its usual winding way, but as if pausing mid-ascent suspended. He looked around. Outside, the world had gone golden. Not lit with sunlight exactly, but suffused. Everything bathed in the soft light of an eternal afternoon. A light that made no shadows. A light that forgave. The trees, the clouds, the rolling fields beyond the windows. They all seemed caught in the midst of movement that never completed. Leaves falling but never landing. A horse mid-gallop across a distant hill, hooves never touching earth. A paper airplane floating, curving gently as if unsure where to land. Thomas stepped into the corridor. Others were there too. Passengers moving slowly, not out of fear or confusion, but in awe. Like dancers discovering gravity had lightened. Someone reached to catch a teacup they'd knocked over, only to find the cup hanging in the air, waiting patiently to be retrieved. The conductor appeared, not one he had seen before. This one was old, not by age, but by presence, as if he had been part of the train since the first track was ever laid down in Dream. His uniform shimmered between colors, sometimes gray, sometimes navy, sometimes white like snowfall, and his eyes were endless. He looked at Thomas. "Do you feel it?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Everything is slower." The conductor smiled. No, everything is fuller.
Thomas tilted his head.
The man continued. This isn't slowness, not truly. This is the world at its actual pace when nothing is rushing to be finished. When every moment is allowed to expand to its natural shape. We only call it slowness because we've forgotten how to stay still. The words settled in Thomas like warm tea. He stepped toward a window and placed his hand against the glass. The warmth of the golden light seeped into his palm. Beside him, a woman was writing a letter without a pen. Her fingers danced in the air, and words formed visibly like gentle ink across invisible parchment. A man hummed a tune that had no melody, but Thomas knew it was his father's. People smiled at one another longer. No one looked at clocks. There were none. He wandered into another car where a table had been set for no one in particular. A bowl of ripe fruit, a candle that had never melted, a chair that no one sat in but had been waiting for someone for a very long time. Thomas sat, and in that moment he felt everything that had once rushed through his life. All the missed chances, the unanswered messages, the moments he had hurried through because he believed there wasn't time to slow down and take a seat beside him. He whispered into the air, not knowing who he was speaking to. I'm sorry for rushing. I didn't know how long I could have stayed. A voice replied not aloud, but through everything around him. You were never late. You were simply early for now. And the train paused, not stopped, but held, like the universe had taken a deep breath and invited everyone aboard to do the same. He looked around. Passengers sipped tea that stayed warm. Conversations lingered without needing words. Eyes met and did not flinch. And somewhere, someone played a piano key that hung in the air like starlight stretched thin. Thomas didn't want to move, and for once, he didn't have to. Time was not something to escape. It was something to feel. And here on the curious train, in the golden light between destination and departure, there was all the time he'd never thought he had. The train began to slow for the final time, but not with the mechanical certainty of brakes or the creak of iron. It slowed like a breath being exhaled, like the hush of a story reaching its last sentence. Thomas stood by the window of cabin 9, eyes half-lidded body, wrapped in a stillness deeper than rest. The golden light outside had softened, deepened now, resembling that hour of dusk where the world pauses, not from tiredness, but in reverence. There was no station in view, no platform, no map to trace what came next. But everyone aboard the train seemed to feel at the end of the line, not as a farewell, but as a return. The conductor appeared in the doorway, not with a clipboard or a question, but with a small knowing smile. It's time, he said gently. Thomas didn't ask where. He didn't need to. The train was not delivering him to a place. It was delivering him back. He stepped into the corridor. The other passengers were already rising, gathering not their belongings, but their selves. The pieces of memory, forgiveness, names, and stories they had picked up along the way. They wore them now like shawls, or sat with them quietly in their hands. No one rushed. The doors opened, not to a platform, but to light. Not blinding, not overwhelming, just warm, inviting. A radiance that felt less like walking into somewhere new, and more like stepping into a part of the world that had been waiting for you to remember it existed. Thomas hesitated. One last look around. Cabin 9. The kettle. The notebook with blank pages. The armchair that had held so many versions of him. He whispered a silent thank you, and stepped off. The light embraced him, not with intensity, but with familiarity. Like the feel of slipping your hand into a glove worn only by you. Like the scent of your pillow after a long journey. He stood there for a moment waiting for something, but nothing happened. No final announcement, no grand reveal, no fanfare. Just peace. He looked ahead. There was a path, yes, but it didn't matter where it led, because something had shifted. He no longer needed to arrive anywhere. He was already home. Not the place, the feeling. And as he took his first step forward, the sound of the train slowly faded behind him. Still moving. Always moving on to the next traveler who needed its gentle grace. And behind him in the place where he had stood, a small breeze whispered words, not spoken aloud but known. You did not dream this. You simply remembered it.